Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 560. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Cal. How are you?
Doing good, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. We got quite a bit of news to talk about, a lot on the war in Ukraine, which of course just hasn't gotten enough attention since everything happened in Israel. I mean, we have a limited amount of resources and time here, so we can't talk in all these wars in as much detail as we would like to, but we got a lot of important stuff to talk about today outside of the war in Gaza. So everybody shared the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We reprint the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and of course follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. All right, Connor, let's get into it. First up here, Niger ends military relationship with U.S., says U.S. presence no longer justified. So Niger announced on Saturday it was suspending military cooperation with the U.S. and that U.S. presence in the country was no longer justified, signaling Washington will have to withdraw its troops. The spokesman for the military-led government in Niger said that's been in power since last year's coup, made the announcement after a U.S. delegation visited Niger. He said that the U.S. officials did not show respect for the country's sovereignty. The U.S. has a major drone base in the country, known as Airbase 201, which was used as a hub for operations in West Africa. Before President Bazoum was taken out of power last July, the U.S. had about 1,100 troops in Niger. As of December, the U.S. says that number has been about cut in half, 650. The U.S. formally declared the ouster of Bazoum a coup, which requires the suspension of aid, but the U.S. was still looking at ways to cooperate with the new government in Niger. However, there are signs that the U.S. is preparing for the possibility of getting kicked out, as the Wall Street Journal has already reported that the U.S. was in talks with other West African states, mainly Benin, the Ivory Coast, and Ghana, over putting a new drone base in their country. Although this seems like it would be quite a significant tactical disadvantage if you look at the region we're talking about here, Connor, the Sahel. This is Northern Africa, the countries maybe south of Libya and stretching to Nigeria, that region of Africa. And so if you're talking about being in Benin, being in the Ivory Coast, Nigeria puts you almost right in the middle of that, where these countries moving much further away. And of course, this is a part of this region, which formerly Francophone Africa. This is where the French government had a lot of colonial control. These countries have been stepping further and further away from that colonial control, and exiling France first from Niger was step one, and getting rid of the U.S. is step two. So I think this is a very big development. We'll likely have quite a few reverberations in the region. What the U.S. decides to do, where they go to build a drone base next. Do they maybe go to Chad or a country like that to kind of really keep their foothold in the region? A lot of questions. Next up, Israeli airstrike hits southern Syria, one soldier injured. So while we have been spending a lot of time talking about the Israeli bombing campaign of Gaza and, a lot in the West Bank or in Lebanon, there is Israeli bombing campaign going on in Syria as well. And this has just been consistent for over a decade now, Connor. I would think about 12 years since 2012, Israel has been bombing Syria. And so it's almost just like a thing that happens, but it's still important to talk about because it could always lead to more and more escalation, especially since the Israelis usually say they're targeting Iranian targets in Syria. And so if they hit something significant, Iran could look to strike back. So this could be a major escalation. Next up here, this one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Israeli airstrike destroys house in Lebanon. An Israeli airstrike against houses in southern Lebanon continued on Sunday, with the same house coming under fire for a second day in a row. Saturday's strike set the house on fire, and today's strike appears to have finished destroying it. Israeli planes also attacked other areas of Lebanon, and an Israeli drone strike was reported at Atib Ash-Shab No word yet on casualties or damage in those strikes. Near daily strikes have been reported by both sides for months, and Hezbollah reported it carried out rocket attacks against Israeli troops near the Lebanese village of Wazani. Israel is yet to comment on the matter, and this is typically the case. Israel is not very open to talking about their operations, and I think for a couple reasons. One is everybody assumes it's Israel anyways, but if something goes wrong and they have a policy of never commenting on it, it gives them an excuse not to talk about it and maybe have some of their proxies in the media sow some doubt about who's really responsible. And then, secondly, here too, if something isn't Israel, but they want to at least seem responsible for everything, right? You're trying to get the Lebanese to back up here, then never taking responsibility, just, anything you're kind of responsible for then at the same time. All right, next up, this is a little bit of a follow up on the article I wrote about the bill banning TikTok, and this is from Ken Klippenstein at The Intercept, and he writes, U.S. intelligence has produced no evidence that the popular social media site has ever coordinated with Beijing. That fact hasn't stopped many in Congress and even President Joe Biden from touting legislation that would force the sale of the app, as the TikTok frenzy fills the news pages with empty conjecture and innuendo. In interviews and testimony to Congress about TikTok, leaders of the FBI, CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence have been in fact careful to qualify that the national security threat posed by TikTok is purely hypothetical. Though top national security officials seem happy to echo allegations of Chinese control of TikTok, they stop short of saying that China has ever actually coordinated with the company. And so that's a pretty significant omission there, Connor. And, it goes again to just to show that where a lot of this is really focused is all around the idea of banning TikTok and its narrative control, right? It's not that China has control over the narrative, it's that we don't, which is, how the US empire adds with everything, right? Anything outside of their control, they view as essentially an existential threat. All right, one more article from myself here before I hand it over to Connor Freeman. This one from our friend Will Porter. Europe to arm Ukraine using seized Russian funds. So Ukraine's Western backers will soon use profits from Russian assets to finance military aid for Kiev, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said. The announcement marked a shift for Berlin, which has been under pressure from allies to endorse the weapons buying scheme. And so, Connor, this is going to be the interest off of the frozen Russian funds. So it's $300 billion, which is going to generate a significant amount of interest. They think it's going to be about $29.5 billion over the next 4 years. And so that's probably going to buy Ukraine quite a bit of weapons with this money. And I'm sure Russia is going to see it as highly provocative. And of course, another problem is, Connor, it just makes it one more step difficult to unwind the war, because Russia is probably going to ask for this money back before they agree to end the war. And Ukraine is likely going to assert that they're not going to give the money to Russia, and the Europeans are going to claim that they don't have the money anymore, and so it won't be a politically popular move in, say, the United States or any of these countries, that their citizens are now paying tax money that ultimately goes to Russia. But that may be what's needed to end the war. So this is problematic. That is going to be an issue for quite some time. Connor, you've written a bunch of really important stuff on the war in Ukraine over the past week, and I want to hand it over to you. This one, Pope Francis receives backlash after calling on Ukraine to negotiate with Russia.
Yes, thank you. And this, of course, dovetails where we have it's not even a stalemate in the war now. It looks like Russia is poised to make some significant gains here, especially over the next year, especially after Ukraine just completely their counteroffensive was such an abysmal failure. But there's still this absolute refusal on the part of the West to support negotiations. And Kyle, you recently covered on antiwar.com this story you wrote about how Russia was speaking through intermediaries and attempting to negotiate some kind of a settlement here at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And this was rejected again by Washington, predictably. But so now we even have the Pope, who has been pretty good on this on the war in Ukraine for the most part, attempting to they established he has an envoy picked out to help negotiate peace, and they stand ready to assist both sides in any way they can to bring the war to an end. But of course, it's not. It's not viewed very favorably, his efforts in Kiev. But so, as I write here, this is from March 10th. Pope Francis is facing backlash from Kiev for his remarks suggesting Ukraine should go to the negotiating table to work out a diplomatic settlement with Russia. In comments made during an interview conducted last month with RSI, the Swiss broadcaster, the Catholic leader once again offered to act as a mediator between the two warring sides. The Ukrainian government has criticized the Pope and reaffirmed their refusal to negotiate with the Kremlin. And an offer like this coming from the Pope to be slapped away is very disappointing, including because the Vatican has already facilitated prisoner swaps between both sides during the war. So, there's somewhat of a proven track record. And to bring him in as an impartial mediator would be a great move, but. We never miss an opportunity to borrow a phrase. The Pope is under fire for saying Kiev should have the, quote, courage of the white flag. And this was what was seized upon for the controversy to try and paint the Pope as being callous or dismissive of Ukraine's efforts to regain their territory. And they seem like the claim was that the Pope was not being fair and treating it as if, Russia isn't the aggressor here. And why aren't you telling Russia to end their war? They're the invaders and all this. But that was actually, he was just responding using the same phraseology that was prompted to him by his interviewer in this discussion. And that was clarified by the Vatican because it was this real main point of contention. So interviewer Lorenzo Buchella put it to the Pope like this, quote, in Ukraine, some call for the courage of surrender of the white flag, but others say this would legitimize the stronger party. What do you think? The Catholic leader responded, it is one interpretation. That is true. I think that the strongest one is the one who looks at the situation, thinks about the people, and has the courage of the white flag and negotiates. He continued, when you see that you are defeated, that things are not going well, it is necessary to have the courage to negotiate. Negotiations are never a surrender, the Pope added. It is the courage not to carry a country to suicide. Pope Francis said international powers should assist in these talks. When asked if he would offer up his services as a potential mediator, the Pope answered affirmatively, I am here. He implored, do not be ashamed of negotiating before things get worse. Ukraine's top diplomat, Dmytro Kuleba, fired back, quote, our flag is a yellow and blue one. This is the flag by which we live, die, and prevail. We shall never raise any other flags. Ukraine's foreign minister went on to thank the Pope, however, for his constant prayers for peace and said that he hopes he will soon visit Ukraine. And then Kiev's ambassador to the Vatican, Andrei Yurash, vowed to refuse diplomacy with Russia. Quote, we will not be peace talking with Hitler. He continued, if we want to finish the war, we have to do everything to kill the dragon. Anton Gerashenko, formerly an advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, blasted the Catholic leader, insisting, quote, it does seem strange that the Pope doesn't urge to defend Ukraine, doesn't condemn Russia as an aggressor who killed tens of thousands of people, doesn't urge Putin to stop, but calls on Ukraine to raise the white flag instead. Archbishop Svatoslav Shevchuk, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, also rebuked the Pope during a meeting with Ukrainians in New York City. He said, quote, Ukraine is wounded, but unconquered. Ukraine is exhausted, but it stands and will endure. Believe me, it never crosses anyone's mind to surrender. So to just, flesh this out, it's very important to note that shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was this infamous interview with Derek Chollet, counselor to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, with the website War on the Rocks on their flagship podcast, where he said, Ukraine's potential NATO membership was never on the table during pre-war talks between the U.S. and Russia. He said it was viewed by the administration as a non-issue. We have subsequently there's been a ton of evidence, but you could even just go to the chief of NATO, the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who said last September, and directly that yes, this was the demand on the part of Russia in our pre-war talks. Putin was saying that if you commit that Ukraine will remain neutral and will not be brought into NATO, then there will be no war. And then he sort of laughs about this, saying, "We didn't sign it. Putin went to war to prevent more NATO in Europe, and look at what he's gotten." I think he was boasting about, the Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. And so since the war began, of course, the U.S. has consistently intervened to sabotage peace talks, including those mediated in the immediate wake of the invasion by former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, as well as the Turkish government. Talks brokered by the latter actually culminated in a draft peace treaty, which, if signed, would have led to Russia pulling back to lines it held before the invasion of February of 2022, and Ukraine committing to a neutral status regarding NATO and its decades-long expansion targeting Russia. In an interview last year, Bennett explained that during the talks he brokered in the wake of the invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin had agreed not to depose the Ukrainian regime, and in turn, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had agreed to renounce his aims to join NATO, which the former Israeli leader again described as, quote, the reason for Russia's invasion. The effort never bore fruit. Bennett lamented, quote, Washington and London blocked it, and I thought they were wrong. There's an interesting footnote in a recent Ted Snyder piece. I believe it was at antiwar.com. It was one of the ones he co-authored with Nikolai Petro. I think it was For Miss, something about For Miss and the war in Ukraine, or keeping the war in Ukraine going, or something like that. And but people can just go to his author profile at antiwar.com and it'll be right there. But there's a quote there from Zelensky in March of 2022, speaking to CNN, I believe, or maybe it was another outlet. But he says, Zelensky himself says that the war was launched by Putin over Ukraine's status with NATO. He goes, as I remember, they started a war over this, our position with NATO. And so there's no real debate about this. And so in April of 2022, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson notoriously made his trek to Kiev, where he told Zelensky that the collective West was not ready to sign on to a deal ending the war, even if Kiev is willing to, effectively killing the progress made by the Istanbul negotiations. And around that time, the Washington Post reported that even a Ukrainian vow not to join NATO, a concession that Zelensky has floated publicly, could be a concern to some neighbors. This leads to an awkward reality. For some in NATO, it's better for the Ukrainians to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early or at too high a cost to Kiev and the rest of Europe. And that was April of 2022. Now, as a result of the Joe Biden administration's proxy war with Russia, Ukraine has lost 20, and this is what the Pope is talking about when he says that this is not, it would be prudent for the leadership in Ukraine to take their country off this path to national suicide. So as a result of the proxy war with Russia, where Washington is using, and London particularly are using Ukraine as a human battering ram, they've lost 20% of their country, and roughly 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been slaughtered or so severely wounded they can't return to the battlefield. After helping to provoke the war, the Pentagon seized upon the opportunity to back Kiev with the aim of, quote, weakening Russia, as Lloyd Austin has said, and crippling its military. With peace talks seemingly ruled out indefinitely by the West, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists warns humanity has never been closer to outright nuclear war. So efforts to bleed Russia's military and economic strength have failed. Despite this rhetoric we hear from hawkish politicians who go, oh, well, we've whatever they say, they've destroyed Russian military capacity by a half with this proxy war. That is not the case. According to Eurocom Chief General Christopher Cavoli, who's also the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, he told Congress last year, Russia's Navy and Air Force have taken only negligible losses, and their ground forces are, quote, bigger today than when the war began. Additionally, the Pentagon is exhausting its own weapons stocks to support Kiev's failing war effort, with Russia's capacity to produce armor and ammo, while Russia's capacity to produce armor and ammo has outstripped the entire NATO alliance. And Will Porter, our colleague, the assistant news editor at the Institute, has this tremendous article I recommend everybody read and share from last week about this NATO intelligence report that CNN reported on first talking about how Russia's their ability to produce artillery has outpaced NATO by 3 times their yearly output of the entire alliance. It's just incredible. And so conversely, as I pointed, compared to Russia's position, Ukraine has depleted its air defenses, its ammunition, its artillery, its manpower. So many Ukrainian troops have been killed that the average age of a soldier fighting Russia is at least 43. Now, last week, following a meeting with Zelensky, this is a couple weeks back now, Erdogan, the Turkish president, said that his government was, quote, ready to host a peace summit that Russia will attend to. According to media reports, though, Zelensky balked at the proposal and declared that he does not see a place for Russia at such a summit, which is predictable from Zelensky. But, this is the kind of thing where the American ruling class should have, the self-awareness to at least call balls and strikes and lean on their puppet to tell him, look, you have to go to the negotiating table. At this point, we're not going to be able to provide you the weapons you need. And as has already been disclosed by your own commanders, you don't even have the manpower to use them, even if we could get them to you. So and then I just recount here that during Biden's recent State of the Union, he opens the State of the Union talking about Ukraine, and how Putin is Hitler and how we need $61 billion to keep the proxy war going. He shouted that his message to Putin is, quote, we will not walk away. We will not bow down. I will not bow down. He was practically screaming. The White House is committed to providing Kiev with approximately $60 billion in military aid, just to keep the war going through the election here in November. And Pope Francis has previously come under fire from halls of power in Ukraine for things which should be they shouldn't be offensive, but he got in a lot of hot water with Ukraine for telling an audience of young Russian Catholics that they should be proud of their national heritage. And before that, he was attacked for condemning the car bomb assassination carried out outside Moscow by Ukrainian forces, which killed journalist Daria Dugina, who's the daughter of the Russian nationalist philosopher Alexander Dugin. Okay, so this next story, Putin to move troops to NATO border in response to war games. So I wrote this for antiwar.com on the 13th. And so what part of the missing context from these stories in the mainstream press was they were either they weren't aware of it or they just weren't talking about it. But this came about, this announcement from Putin and this interview where the quotes from this story and the next one are cited. This comes as NATO was carrying out massive war drills called Nordic Response 24 in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, with 20,000 troops and 50 allied vessels and I believe 100 military aircraft. And so, this is very provocative. We just brought Finland into the NATO alliance. That's doubled the border NATO shares with Russia, which was unthinkable only a few decades ago. And now, of course, we're talking about an 800-mile border that Finland shares with Russia. So you've got major NATO drills going on next door. That's, extremely provocative, especially during wartime. So as I write here, as the North Atlantic Alliance wraps up its massive Nordic Response 24 war drills, Russian President Vladimir Putin is threatening to deploy troops and weapon systems alongside his country's shared 800-mile border with Finland. This comes amid a rash of hostile rhetoric in NATO capitals regarding sending alliance troops to Ukraine as Kiev's war effort is failing, including from heads of state such as French President Emmanuel Macron. So Helsinki recently joined NATO, and the Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo is talking up increased military spending aimed at Russia. On Wednesday, in an interview with Russian state media, Putin said the decision by Stockholm and Helsinki to join NATO in the wake of Moscow's invasion and the U.S.-led alliance's proxy war was a, quote, absolutely senseless step from the point of view of ensuring their own national interests. He continued, we generally had ideal relations with Finland, simply perfect. We did not have a single claim against each other, especially territorial, not to mention other areas. We didn't have troops. We removed all the troops from the Russian-Finnish border. The Russian went on to conclude, however, if it's up to them, it is up to them to decide. That's what they decided, but we didn't have troops there. Now we will. The NATO alliance is currently carrying out major war games in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And there's 20,000 troops in 13 different NATO states. And then, as I said, 50 ships and 100 warplanes. At the same time, Orpo is warning the Kremlin is preparing for a, quote, long conflict with the West. So speaking to the European Parliament, the Finnish leader implored member states to increase military spending and coordinate against Russia. He said Russia represents a permanent and essential military threat to Europe. If we, as a united Europe, fail to respond sufficiently to this challenge, the coming years will be filled with danger and the looming threat of attack. Russia is not invincible, he then declared. Orpo added that the European Union must be responsible for its own defense and not be held hostage by American elections, suggesting Republican frontrunner Donald Trump would not be as supportive of the Washington-led military bloc, if only we were so lucky. But nevertheless, it makes for good rhetoric. Denmark, a founding member of NATO, announced on Wednesday that it would be boosting its military budget by nearly $6 billion over the next 5 years. Al Jazeera reported the increased funding will be used both to boost Denmark's military capacity and to provide aid to Ukraine. It will also go towards an expansion of conscription, which will be extended from 4 to 11 months and will include women for the first time. So in the name of defending democracy, when Ukraine is, by no reasonable metric can be described as a democracy, with the attacks, persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, banning opposition parties, nationalizing the media across every medium from TV, radio, and the internet. And now, of course, these NATO states, including us, are moving further and further towards fascism, if we're not already there. I do believe that's a fair way to describe the American system. But as you can see, we're talking about more conscription and throwing women into the military. It's just very alarming. And in the meantime, London is supplying Ukraine with 10,000 drones. Kiev is using just such weapons to target multiple regions in Russia leading up to the country's presidential election just days away. We'll get more into that here toward the end of the show. Washington announced a $300 million military aid package for Kiev earlier this month, which includes cluster bombs, because that's how much we care. Banned by more than 100 countries. These weapons are notorious because they spread large numbers of small submunitions, or bomblets, as they're called, across a target area, and they don't all explode on impact. They can maim and kill civilians for years and decades after a war has ended. For instance, in Laos, since the end of the Vietnam War, in the last several decades, we've seen at least 20,000 civilians be killed by these things. So, I mean, when you consider that Ukraine is the most heavily mined country on the planet, we've been sending over tanks armed with depleted uranium munitions, which are heavily toxic and have been linked to birth defects and all kinds of horrible deformities and cancers. And then, of course, the cluster bombs, it becomes very evident that Ukraine is really just viewed as I say, pawns on a chessboard, a human battering ram, whatever metaphor works best. But this is the policy. And we've depleted our 155 millimeter artillery shells at the standard variants. So they're sending over more and more cluster bombs as talk about sending longer range missiles continues apace in NATO capitals, which will only be used with the way the war is going for further attacks against the Crimean Peninsula and inside mainland Russia, as we're seeing increased attacks in Western Russia, and including raids by hundreds of neo-Nazis armed with American weapons and tied to Ukrainian military intelligence. So the risk of escalation looks to be getting worse, not better, in the near term, even though right now, as in the first story, as the Pope makes clear, there were much better opportunities for negotiations where Ukraine could have secured more favorable conditions from the Russians, but now is better than any time coming down the pipe. So, but that's not the direction the West is going. Okay, to wit, this next story: Putin threatens to use nukes as NATO continues saber rattling. As I wrote this on the 13th as well. So Moscow will use nuclear weapons if Russia perceives an existential threat to its independence or sovereignty, President Vladimir Putin reaffirmed on Wednesday. This comes amid a spate of provocative rhetoric in NATO capitals, including discussions regarding deploying alliance troops to Ukraine. Now, during an interview with Russian state television, Putin said the Kremlin is prepared to resort to nuclear weapons use if there is a threat to, quote, the existence of the Russian state, our sovereignty and independence. He continued, all of that is written in our strategy. We haven't changed it. The Russian leader was asked if he ever considered using tactical battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but he said that hasn't been necessary. Putin explained that he does not believe the world is heading for nuclear war. Rather, and I got a bit of a chuckle out of this when I first read it, but I think Putin's being actually sincere here. It's just a little ridiculous. Rather, he feels that Joe Biden, his American counterpart, is a veteran politician who comprehends the dire risks of any escalation that would reach such a threshold. However, Putin did address the hawkish remarks made by NATO officials and even heads of state recently, saying, the nations that say they have no red lines regarding Russia should realize that Russia won't have any red lines regarding them either. And so this is a reference to Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuania's top diplomat, who embraced French President Emmanuel Macron's recent remarks that, quote, nothing can be ruled out regarding the deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine. So Landsbergis was enthusing that now is the right time to discuss this. Starting this conversation erases the red lines we have imposed on ourselves. And it's funny that he uses that rhetoric. I actually wrote a piece with that title in December of 2022 when Ukraine started carrying out these drone attacks using American intelligence against targets, Russian military targets, including airfields or bases, which were holding nuclear-capable bombers. And there was this report in the London Times that the Pentagon had tacitly supported these kinds of attacks, and basically the implication was that this was going to continue, and it has. These large-scale drone attacks, this prolonged drone warfare that Ukraine has been waging using American intelligence against the Russian mainland and Crimea, for that matter. And so but that was the point, was that we're constantly erasing these red lines to the point where we don't know exactly when we get to the point when NATO and Russia will come to direct blows and direct war. And that's been the worst risk of this conflict to begin with. And they look at it as like, I look at it as erasing the lines could mean we're headed for World War III and we're kind of in the dark and can't see where the red lines are because we've probably already stepped over them. And so in this case, he's saying that just ignore the red lines. It'll make you'll feel better about escalating the war because you won't be worried. Let's just say they're erased. And let's send troops. This is the time. This is the time to have the conversation. So very hawkish rhetoric. And then you have Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski confirming the presence of NATO troops in Ukraine 2 weeks ago during an event celebrating Warsaw's 25-year membership with the alliance, saying NATO soldiers are already present in Ukraine, and I would like to thank the ambassadors of those countries who have taken that risk. And so it's just incredible to see all this. If, say, we go to war with Russia, we can rest assured that Lithuania and Poland will have our backs. And this comes, of course, at the same time we have the head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, along with other officers being caught on a leaked tape last month, acknowledging the presence of British troops in the embattled country where those forces are helping Ukrainian troops fire the Storm Shadow missiles that London has provided, which have been used to attack Crimea and to attack civilian targets in the Donbass. And the UK confirmed a week earlier that a small number of British troops are on the ground, quote, supporting the armed forces of Ukraine. A recording of the conversation between the German military officers that was recently published by Russian media revealed that the UK has soldiers on the ground in Ukraine helping Ukrainian forces use Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of 155 miles, making them capable of hitting targets throughout Crimea. And attacks of Crimea on Crimea have always been considered a red line for Putin, but the risk of escalation hasn't stopped Ukraine's Western backers from assisting with such strikes, as Storm Shadows have been reported to be used in multiple Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. The UK has also helped Ukraine strike Russian ships in the Black Sea. Another recent report from the Times credited Radican with helping the Ukrainians with the strategy to destroy Russian ships and open up the Black Sea. Excuse me. This is the wrong article. My bad. Let's see. So. The officers also discussed plans to provide Taurus missiles to Kiev. That was, they also described they also mentioned that there were British troops on the ground helping target Russian targets or helping hit Russian targets with the Storm Shadow missiles. But further than that, they were talking about providing Taurus missiles to Kiev, weapons which have a range of roughly 300 miles in hopes of carrying out attacks against Russia. The Kremlin responded to this by saying this makes it clear that plans to carry out strikes inside Russia are under discussion. So following Macron's inflammatory comments, Putin addressed the Federal Assembly and made clear our strategic nuclear forces are on full combat alert and the ability to use them is assured. He went further, pointing to the possibility of nuclear attacks on NATO states, emphasizing now they have started talking about the possibility of deploying NATO military contingents to Ukraine. They must grasp that we also have weapons. Yes, they know this, as I have just said, capable of striking targets on their territory. Putin highlighted Kiev's failing war effort and said Washington, as well as other Ukraine's other Western backers, will have to negotiate a deal to end the war on terms that Russia finds acceptable. He said it shouldn't be a break for the enemy to rearm, but a serious talk involving the guarantees of the security of the Russian Federation. And that's just funny to me because that's what the the Hillary Clintonites are always saying, is that's why we can't negotiate with Russia, because he'll just use that time to rearm and build up for another offensive, and he'll just reinvade Ukraine. And they use the same arguments. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. makes the same case for why it's better to support the genocide in Gaza than to push for a ceasefire and negotiations, because Hamas will just use the ceasefire as an opportunity to rearm and build up and carry out another October 7th style attack. So on the one hand, you have, he opposes this kind of rhetoric from the Clintonites when it comes to Ukraine, but then regurgitates the same kind of nonsense when it comes to Gaza. But so Putin highlighted, in 2022, we have Angela Merkel and other officials suggesting that the Berlin and Paris brokered Minsk Accords, which were agreed to by Ukraine and Russia and were backed by the U.S. and the UN, were secretly just meant to give Ukraine time to build up a formidable military for a war with Russia. And that's, I believe, ultimately what Putin is referring to. The accords were intended to resolve the civil war in Ukraine following the U.S.-backed coup in 2014, which ultimately led to Russia's invasion 8 years later. Now, Reuters reported on last 2 Wednesdays ago that the Kremlin made efforts at the end of 2023 and the beginning of this year to reach a ceasefire deal with the United States, but Washington once again rejected a diplomatic option. And so in April of 2022, as I mentioned earlier, there was a tentative peace agreement. There was a draft peace treaty, and we could have ended the war right there. But, of course, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and told Zelensky, you're going to keep the war going or we're not going to support you. And even if you're ready to sign on to some deal, we're not. And so, of course, they saw this as an opportunity to bleed Russia, but instead it looks like it's bled Ukraine much more significantly when you consider the fact that they've lost about 500,000 people, either killed or just gravely injured. So this next story is about the UK advising that Ukraine begin attacking Crimea and focusing on more defensive options in the east, but taking the war to Crimea, which of course could cross a great deal of red lines that are supposedly erased. So UK advises Ukraine to stay on defensive in the east and focus on targeting Crimea. And this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on the 17th. So British military officials advise that Ukraine should focus on defense in its ground fight against Russia in the east while focusing on targeted strikes against Crimea and Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the Sunday Times reported. So the advice was given when British Defense Secretary Grant Shapps and UK Army Chief Anthony Radakin visited Ukraine last week. The British officials said that rather than attacking, Ukrainian forces should hold the line and pull back to more favorable ground if necessary. The report said this will allow the Ukrainians to focus their efforts on the Black Sea and Crimea, where their forces, with the help of Western long-range missiles, have landed significant blows over the past 6 months. So Dave references again that recording of German military officers published by the Russian media that revealed the UK has troops on the ground in Ukraine. and they're helping to guide the Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of over 155 miles. And that's the longest range weapons system that any NATO member has provided up to this point. But attacks on Crimea have always been considered a red line for Putin. The risk of escalation hasn't stopped Ukraine's Western backers from assisting with such strikes. The Storm Shadows have been reported to be used in multiple Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. The UK has also helped Ukraine attack Russian ships in the Black Sea. Another recent report from the Times credited Radican with helping the Ukrainians with the strategy to destroy Russian ships and open up in the Black Sea. Ukrainian attacks on Crimea and territory inside the Russian mainland have increased since it's become clear that Ukraine has no chance of winning on the battlefield. Since Russia captured the strategic Donetsk city of Avdiivka last month, Russian forces have been making steady gains in the east, and Ukraine is suffering from serious manpower and weapon shortages. Okay, so the last story today is about this wave of drone attacks across Western Russia, and also a very significant attack by the Russian Volunteer Corps and their partners. And those are Russian volunteers fighting on Ukraine's side in the war, but they're avowed neo-Nazis. And this has been confirmed, as well as the fact that they're carrying American weapons in the Financial Times and other mainstream media reports back when they attacked the Belgorod region, I believe last April or May. And that was very controversial when it happened, but this attack is it's pretty large. The Russians are claiming they killed 550 fighters in this most recent attack against civilian areas in the Belgorod region. So Ukraine launches dozens of drone attacks across Western Russia. Ukraine launched dozens of drones across the region over the weekend, attacks that coincided with Russian elections, which saw Vladimir Putin win another term, according to preliminary results. So the Russian Defense Ministry says that their forces shot down 35 Ukrainian drones across 8 Russian oblasts on Sunday morning. According to South Front, Russian forces downed a total of 54 drones on Saturday and Sunday. The Russian Defense Ministry said 17 drones were downed in Russia's southern Krasnodar Oblast on Sunday, and 4 were intercepted in the Moscow region. Local authorities said one person died of a heart attack during an attack on an oil refinery in Krasnodar, but no other casualties were reported. South Front said a total of 19 drones targeted the border region of Belgorod throughout the weekend, and last week militias fighting for Ukraine made up of Russian volunteers, including the neo-Nazi Russian Volunteer Corps, attempted a ground invasion into Belgorod and the Kursk Oblast using tanks and U.S. armored vehicles. The Russian Volunteer Corps has previously said it's armed with U.S.-made armored vehicles, and Russia said it destroyed Bradley fighting vehicles during the raid. Moscow said that they killed 550 fighters and thwarted the attack, while the Russian Volunteer Corps claimed that fighting is ongoing. The uptick in Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory comes as Ukraine is facing significant losses of territory on the battlefield. The Ukrainian operations inside Russia always risk a major escalation, since Moscow views them as NATO-assisted attacks. And very importantly, The Economist reported last year that these drone attacks on Russia use Western-provided intelligence. In fact, they would be impossible without that intelligence. One of the points that they were sort of talking up the collaboration between these Western intelligence agencies and Ukraine, but they wouldn't be able to get through this many different lines of Russian air defenses without getting, intelligence that they don't have the capability to gather. They rely on the Americans and other partners to help them do that, and they fire them usually very early in the morning and go through other tactics to avoid being detected or shot down. But that's again, so anytime you see these drone attacks, including when they attack the Kremlin, or these targets that are, as I mentioned earlier, from the end of 2022, that are hundreds of miles sometimes deep inside Russia, it is well known within the Kremlin that these attacks are green-lighted and underwritten and facilitated by NATO. And so, again, as we have Emmanuel Macron, who is not just doubling down, but tripling and quadrupling down on his most hawkish rhetoric about sending troops here soon to Ukraine. He said in a televised interview last week that the outcome of this war is existential for Europe and NATO, and that if necessary, NATO will intervene in order to prevent Ukraine from losing the war, or Russia from winning the war, which is just, I mean, it's just shocking that he can get away with saying stuff like this. And I mean, it's well known that, as Putin makes clear, he says that I will only, and he's not, even when it's a threat to use nuclear weapons, but he's just reaffirming their policy, which is that if they perceive an existential threat to Russia or its sovereignty, that they will then use nuclear weapons. And this is, we know from, I mean, it was in May of 2022, I believe, that Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, told Congress that, look, we don't believe he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine anytime soon, but they could use nukes if they perceive that they are losing the war. That could be, I mean, we could go to nuclear war if Russia is put into a position where they fear that they are going to lose this war in Ukraine and that their sovereignty could be threatened. And that is what has been reaffirmed by Putin. And Macron is essentially saying that if things keep going the way they're going, we're going to have to send in troops in order to change the balance on the battlefield and go to direct war with Russia. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's just outlandish rhetoric for the time being, but it is very alarming. Ted Snyder has some great pieces up, one new one at the Institute this morning, talking about what could be the angle potentially on why we're seeing this flood of rhetoric talking about sending NATO troops to Ukraine, when we know from the Discord leaks that there's at least 97 special operations forces, including Americans and French and British and Latvian. I think the bulk of those are British forces.
Well, it just reeks of desperation, doesn't it, Connor?
Yeah.
I mean, no matter what the angle is, it's desperate. And I think the best hope is maybe the West has realized they lost, and this is some sort of almost madman theory type of negotiations, right? Where Ukraine doesn't have much to offer Russia at this point. And so if you say we're going to put our troops into Ukraine, then you could say, well, we won't put our troops into Ukraine if you withdraw some Russian troops from this area of Ukraine or something. Yeah, not that I think it's going to play out. Again, this is very desperate maneuvering, whatever's going on here. But it does seem like this is not going well, whatever is going on in the West.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the Kremlin, if that is the case, and that could be true, or they're looking to just squeeze more money out of their taxpayers in these various countries, including ours. But regardless of what the intent is, if that is the point, is the madman theory of negotiations, then I know the Kremlin, they seem to have a very good understanding of American politics and Western politics. So I hope they're willing to play along with that, because that is certainly, they're really playing with fire if they intend to do much more to prove that they mean that, just to, at least for the sake of negotiation. Right. I mean, how many troops are you going to actually send, right? So we'll have to see. But at the moment, I have no confidence in the current leadership.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for coming back on the show this week. We'll have to do this again soon. Everybody subscribe to the show. We'll have a lot going on this week. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kyle.